Hi, welcome to our Ask the Expert session. I'm Dan O'Brien, a software engineer focusing on the developer experience, and with me today are Dawn Parzuk and Heidi Waterhouse. Both have extensive experience in what to think about when implementing LaunchDarkly in a maintainable and scalable way. We're here to answer questions you might have about how to take feature flagging to the next level with Microsoft and LaunchDarkly. First, we'll start with a quick overview of a few best practices for feature flagging and common questions we've heard from customers. Heidi, will you take us through what you should think about before creating a feature flag and how that plays into the overall life cycle of the flag?
Happy to, Dan. So one of the things that I tell people a lot when we're thinking about feature flagging is that you need to think about these things before you create your first feature flag. You need to have a plan for how it gets made, who controls it, what it interacts with, and how you're going to get rid of it, just like with any other part of the software development lifecycle. Is it going to be a short-term flag or a long-term flag? We'll talk about that in a minute. You want to set up naming conventions, and you want to add those naming conventions to some kind of enforcement, the same way you do linting on class names or however you manage your coding standards. That means that people are going to be able to find what they want. We frequently suggest that people put team names as the start of a flag so that it's easy to sort them in a list. And we also suggest that people use tagging, which is not only useful for searching and sorting, but is also semantically meaningful for access control. And we want to make sure that the flag is only doing one thing. If you describe a flag and you use the word "and" to describe how it works, you actually have two different flags and you should separate those. So on the next slide, we want to talk about why it's important to understand the difference between short-term and long-term flags. A short-term flag is something that is future technical debt. It's something that you're going to want to remove eventually. And we use these things for like progressive delivery of features, release management, validation testing, A/B testing, canary deployments, all sorts of things where the end state of the code is like finalized and set, and you're not going to want to switch it back and forth. Long-term flags, on the other hand, are things like personalization and entitlements, kill switches, pricing tiers, other things that are really going to be something that you want to have as part of the architecture, both of your software and of your business. So when you're thinking about your flags, it's really useful to understand which of those you want to do. Next slide. So the ability to move quickly without taking on additional risk is really only possible if you have the right infrastructure in place to do it. If you want to move quickly and collaborate, you're going to need to be able to do this as a team, and you're going to need to be able to see what other people are doing and thinking. So you want to be able to compare flags across a number of different environments so that you know what's test and what's dev and what's prod, and you're sure how each of them is behaving. You want to use custom roles to make sure that only the people you want to have access to them. When you think about, say, an entitlements flag, it's really easy to understand that if you have a premium product, you want to make sure that only authorized people can do the premium product assignment. You don't want everybody in the company to be able to assign themselves to a premium product. So you have roles that constrain that. And finally, I think it's really useful to have code references, because there comes a time when the person who wrote the flag is not the person who's maintaining the flag. And you need to have a way to make sure that you know all of the places in the code that the flag exists. So this gives you a way to quickly look up what's happening and where it is in the code. So Dan, would you like to tell us a little more?
Sure, thanks Heidi. Here's a sampling of some of our integrations with the Microsoft ecosystem. For example, in our IDE integration with Vscode, you can see real-time flag data from LaunchDarkly right in the editor. And we'll take a little bit deeper look at that in just a moment. With Microsoft Teams, you can receive real-time notifications about changes to LaunchDarkly resources that your team is interested in. For example, if you want to be notified every time a flag changes in production, that's entirely possible. With Azure Event Hubs, you can receive a fire hose of all feature flag evaluations as they're happening. This can empower your data science team to do further analytics on all that information that's flowing through the pipeline. And then with GitHub, it integrates directly with our code references. So now you have a first-class integration where you can run code references as a GitHub action. Let's take a little bit deeper look at code references. A common question we hear is, how do I know where my flags are and across how many repositories do they exist? Is this flag used across just a single repo or across multiple different applications? With code references, this is a first-class integration with your version control where we never need direct access to your code. You would run this as part of your build pipeline, and you can push over as little as just a file name and a line number, and we can show you everywhere that that feature flag is being used at across all those different code bases. So this gives you that single pane of glass to refer back to get a look of where this is used at across all of them. Now let's take a look at what our Vscode integration has to offer. As I was just mentioning, with our Vscode integration, you have this information at your fingertips. So now when you hover over that flag key or an alias for that flag key, you can see all the contextual information, such as descriptions for not only the flag, but each of the variations, and also if that flag is on or off. You also have a full tree view that is a list of all of your feature flags, and you can right click and toggle the state of that flag without having to leave your editor. Now that we've taken a look at a few of our integrations, let's jump in and see what's available in the dashboard. Another common question we've had from teams around technical debt management is, how do you keep track of all of your flags? And we've run into this ourselves before having filters. Now you have the ability to create customized dashboards that you can filter just the flags and resources that you are interested in. This can help you keep that maintainable list. You can filter based on tags, on the flag type, whether it's temporary or permanent, as Heidi was talking about. Also for flag statuses, so you can see if this flag is active or not. And you can also see, is this available to our client-side SDKs, and is it attached to an experiment? So there's a number of ways that you can customize your flag list to see just those pieces that you're interested in. And with that, we're happy to take any questions from the audience.
Great. So while we wait for people to type their questions into the chat, I have a couple of questions for the two of you. So Heidi, you were talking about technical debt, and we talk a lot about technical debt, and one of the favorite tools for addressing technical debt from my perspective is this concept of Git stash. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how people can use that to address technical debt?
I love this one because it's super neuroscience-y. Every time we have to put like all of code in our brain, it takes a lot of RAM to understand what we're doing. And every time we come back to it, we have to reload all of that into RAM in our minds. So the thing that the git stash command allows you to do is to write the end state of a post flag code as you're writing the code. So you write the flag, you write your conditional code in, and then you commit that, and then you write how the code will behave and look afterwards. And that gives you a chance to stash it without committing it. And when you are ready to switch over to the final state, this flag has proven itself state, then you're going to be able to just push commit and push the new thing in, but you don't have to reload all of the things in your mind to understand what's going on. So it really eases a lot of the cognitive load, and it really helps with team continuity because you've already established what's going to happen.
That's great. And I know, Dan, this ties into a lot of what you talk about with wanting to stay in context. You know, when you're constantly interrupted, like the ability to get like that productivity back takes a long time. So what are some of the ways that you use feature flags and LaunchDarkly and Microsoft products kind of stay in context and prevent that continual context switching?
Absolutely. And I'm a person that is easily distracted. So I like to stay in context for as long as possible. And with pieces like our Vscode integration there, the reason I like it so much is that it can help you keep that context without jumping back and forth between, for example, like a web browser and having to pull in additional pieces. Because the more screens I jump through, the more focus I lose. So with keeping all that information at your fingertips, it allows you to continue working on that code and those feature flags without ever having to leave your editor, which I find being the most productive.
Great. And can you talk a little bit about any other integrations that may help people stay in a context and eliminate technical debt?
Sure. Another one of my favorite topics is chat ops. And with Microsoft Teams, when you're coordinating with your team, especially now that everyone is remote, you know, coordination through chat is even more important than it ever was. So with that integration, now as changes are happening in your LaunchDarkly environments, you can pull that context into ongoing conversations that you're having with your team, where before it's harder to pull this information in. So when you have that in the flow of your previous conversation, it just gives you that backlog that you can go back and refer to and see changes as they're happening to build up. Okay, this flag changed this morning, and I never even had to leave the tool where someone was then asking about an issue.
Very cool. You know, we're obviously like huge fans of feature flags. We use a ton of them internally. But for both of you, what would you say are cases where a flag may not necessarily be appropriate, or, you know, we don't want to use a flag in that instance?
I think one of the things that I've seen people sort of misuse flags to do is something that should be done by repeatable configuration. So there are some times, especially in operations, where you need to have like, this is the IP address. Please don't use flags for that. I mean, there's like a very few rare cases where that would be useful, but for the most part, if it's something that you would put in a container recipe or something that you put in a config file, you probably don't need to be putting it in a flag because it's a different kind of state that you don't expect to change as much.
Heidi took the answer right out of my mouth with it too. I was going to say the same thing around configuration management because it is a common question we hear. And there are other tools for configuration management. I like to describe feature flags though as being good for anything that you need runtime control over. So if you need that live runtime control, then it could be a good use case for feature flagging. Data lake configuration management, generally you don't have that runtime or that need for that runtime control.
That said, on API inputs into your data lake, you do want that kind of runtime control, because I've seen a case where people have put instrumentation on their inbound API that's writing into their system. And if they exceed a certain normal threshold, they're like, maybe something weird is going on and I don't want to feed this data into my data lake because it might be corrupt. Let's switch that over to an isolated system and make sure that it's valid before we ingest it.
Great. And Heidi, you touched a little bit on kind of some best practices around feature flags and ways that they can be used. What are some of the more advanced use cases of feature flags if you've gotten past that feature release side of things?
I really like flag dependencies. I think that they are an immensely powerful tool because they allow teams to work on their part of a very large project independently, launch it into production, do real life testing without showing it to any of the users, and yet none of it goes live until the leader flag is live, that top level flag. And that gives teams so much ability to do sort of what we think of in the project to product world as like decoupled production releases. And I think that's really a cool idea.
How about you, Dan? Is there any cool use cases that you've seen?
I don't know if I would call it entirely advanced, but one of my favorite types of use cases is what Heidi was mentioning previously of really having that runtime control over operational aspects of the application. So I was previously a DevOps engineer, so I always like operational use cases where, for example, you can change things like logging levels, API rate limiting. You could, if you needed it, batch sizing. So that falls where it could almost be configuration, but sometimes you need that live control of batch sizing. Or I've also worked with a customer that was determining if they should persist data to the database, similar to what Heidi was saying for a data lake, but this was just the general persistence. So any of those operational use cases, I think, are great reasons for flags.
I'd also say, Dan, that several of the use cases you mentioned are non-Boolean flags. Like when we saw people do log levels, they had, a flag that had 7 different levels for all of their log levels, or people are using it for load distribution. We use it internally for load distribution on our support team so that we can turn on and off which support people are available and distribute cases fairly to them. I think that the non-Boolean feature flags is a really exciting thing to explore and think about.
Absolutely. It enables, or it unlocks so many use cases for feature flags that you don't think of upfront. Like I know some customers also using it for things like status messages that you can control that by your feature flag.
And like you mentioned operational flags, and that kind of makes me worry that you have lots of people in here touching flags, and what happens when something that shouldn't be toggled gets toggled by the wrong person because they weren't quite aware of what that flag was supposed to do?
That's where our custom roles come into play so that you can limit down what different team members have control of in LaunchDarkly itself. So, for example, you can have certain flags tagged PM and then give your product managers control of those flags in production, while the operations team can have theirs tagged ops, and then the operations team can control those flags. And along with that, I think another major aspect of this is the auditability. So it's not just making changes to the system, but also that you have an append-only audit log that goes back through the environment. So as you're making changes, they're getting added to the append-only audit log. So you can see who made what change when. And another one of my favorite features is I kind of correlated to the git commit message. You can enforce commenting in LaunchDarkly. So when someone's making a change, you're not only getting the what, but with enforced commenting, you can get the why, similar to that git commit message.
Very cool. And we have a question coming in from the audience here. Any suggestions for sample reference code projects leveraging good practices in feature flagging?
I think that we have an extensive GitHub library of our SDK examples, basically like little hello world examples. We don't have a lot of access to our customers' best practice flags. Nobody wants that. Dan, do you have any samples that we want to show people?
I can't think of any specific sample repos off the top of my head. I do know under our docs section, we do have an entire guide around best practices for implementing. So that may be worth checking out.
Great, thank you. And again, we've got, I think, about 10 minutes left here, so please drop your questions into chat. We'll continue the conversation here, but we want to be answering your questions here as well. So when you release a flag, some people are able to kind of release on their own, and some people need to go through checks, whether it's security, compliance, release manager, whoever it is. How can companies use those approval processes and still get the benefits of feature flags?
I really feel like the benefit of feature flags, like at core, is the ability to decouple deployment from release, and being able to put your code in production and test it in a real world environment is really different than showing it to your customers. And so when we're talking about how to do this separation of concerns, I think it's really useful to say, like, maybe what we need to look at is who makes business decisions and who makes technology decisions, and break up that sort of uniform, I guess I have to find a coder to do it feeling. Because sometimes they're developers like 2 months down the line, by the time you get to releasing, they're done, they're out, and we need to do something better about that.
And I think that's a great point you make of separating those. And also, as a developer, at least most of them that I've talked to really don't want to get a ticket just to go in and make a change in production, when that can be safely handed over to the business units once it's all been out there in production and validated already. They're happy to continue on with project work. So by really separating those two, the developers can continue on their backlog and getting new features out there, while the business makes the decisions of, is marketing ready, is everyone coordinated, and then control when is that feature actually launched.
I know when we're talking about releases don't always happen at a reasonable time. And if you're like me, I like my sleep. I have things that I need to be doing. How can you support like releasing at off hours without having to be up in the middle of the night?
I would say, first, I would ask why you need to release it off hours. The reason we usually do that is to avoid user disruption. Like, the lowest number of people are going to call and complain at us at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning. But if we can do this ring deployment, this progressive deployment where we test with only a few people who are operating smaller systems and work out the problems, then we should be releasing and deploying much more often. The Accelerate book really talks about how the faster we can get releases out the door, the less like ceremonial and big deal and stay up all night they become. And it's just like something you do 3 times a day, like, oh, I'm going to lunch, I guess I'll hit the button. That really changes the perspective of why you need to be doing these late night high risk releases. Dan?
Yes, and then along with that, having the ability to do the testing in production, so where you can have it released out there and validate it, means that there's less risk, because doing that deployment doesn't mean it's turned on right at that moment. So that, combined with those smaller deltas, where if you're releasing 3 times a day, the number of changes go into that release is so much smaller and less risk than one big release, which, as Heidi was saying, just ends up having more rituals around it. So this helps your teams move faster and safer.
And you bring up testing and production, and that sometimes gets a pretty bad rap, because people assume that, well, you can't, like, you have to do unit testing, you have to do integration testing, you have to do all this QA work. Can you talk a little bit about what we mean by testing and production? And are we saying you don't need to do all those other types of tests and just release it and cross your fingers and hope?
Sure. We are definitely saying to still do your normal testing there, but what I like to describe it as is testing in production is progression. You can still have your lower environments, but this gives you more safety in production itself. Rather than releasing it out there and just hoping everything goes okay, now you can have it out in production and just on for either your automated test if you're running those, or for your QA and testing teams, can go in and validate it against that whole production instance and say, okay, everything's okay, before we release it for the rest of our customers. Now, I know we also have some customers that have gotten rid of lower environments. So that is possible where you can get there, but this is really a decision for your team to make as you go along that journey. Heidi, what are your thoughts on it?
I think that when we say testing in production, we are definitely not saying stop doing integration and unit testing. What we're saying is everybody is testing in production, whether or not they're willing to acknowledge this. This is really, it fits into the chaos engineering ethos, where we need to know how our system responds in the real world in real time, because otherwise we're just guessing. Like, we're saying it's testing, but it's just our best guess. And doing it in production is the most accurate way to test it, because almost no one has an actual like replicated full all up with all the connections and weirdness and dark net problems that you do in production.
Right. We have another question from the audience, and I think we hear this quite frequently. Any tips for migrating away from an existing, less robust internal feature flag system?
Depends on how long you have to do it. There's a couple patterns, let's say. The first one is you just move to LaunchDarkly and you do all of your new features in LaunchDarkly, and you, like, as your old features sunset, it naturally decreases. But that means you have to maintain that homegrown system for a long time, and they're expensive to maintain. This is part of the problem. The other thing is that you do it more like a refactor. So every time you touch a piece of code, you do that. The thing is, you shouldn't have a bunch of feature flags that need to be transitioned that aren't ops flags, or that aren't permanent flags. Like if you have a bunch of temporary flags, it doesn't matter because they're temporary. They release flags, and you should take them out anyway.
Great.
All right, I am going to interject and let you know that you have 4 minutes, a little under 4 minutes left before the session ends.
Excellent, thank you.
Dan, did you have anything else on migration?
No, I think you covered it perfectly, and you have to evaluate those options. I guess one last thing I would like to point out is we do also have a full REST API. So if some of them do need to be migrated, you can do this all programmatically and import those kind of feature flags as an option.
And as we're wrapping up, we've talked about all these things. Like, how do you suggest that somebody gets started with feature flagging?
So I would think of that myself as generally starting with Boolean flags for a small feature. And what we commonly suggest too is to run that feature through to production just to see how that process goes, and then build on it iteratively. So then you can start using feature flags more and more. This is if you're starting from not feature flagging at all. If you already have your robust homegrown solution and you're migrating that, it's kind of a different journey there.
You mean you wouldn't suggest starting with one of your most high-risk, high-profile applications and doing lots of stuff with that?
No, not as much. We have a client who talked about how to get the business to come along, and they were really worried because they were in financial services and they didn't want to touch anything that had to do with their core business value. So they used feature flags on the website, proved the usefulness and stability on something that was lower stakes, and then they could get into the more core business value of what they were doing. And I thought that was a great example of how you would get started. It's like, pick something that is not catastrophic. Not because we think we're going to fail, but because you'll be less nervous. Excellent.
So as we wrap up, I'd like to ask both of you the same question here. And any last parting words of advice, things that everybody needs to know about feature flags before we sign off?
If you aren't using feature flags and deploying broken code into production, you are not actually doing continuous integration and continuous deployment. Fighting words.
And I'll follow up on a point Heidi made earlier. When you're going on this journey, think about your naming conventions up front, because that will save you down the line. So it's one of those things you just want to think about before implementing, is how are the teams going to cooperate together for maintaining these flags?
Excellent. I want to thank both of you for taking the time and answering the questions and sharing your knowledge with the attendees here at Build. This has been a fun experience, and have a great day.
All right. Thank you so much, Dawn and Dan.
Thank you.